thanks to Green Mountain Academy and Gloria for inviting me to speak today. Thanks to all of you for coming. I am indeed a medievalist, and I am indeed a historian, but I must confess I do love the personalities of this period. I have since I was a young man. There's a lot of political history here, but the narratives of the personalities creep in and out, in and around the surface of politics and institutions. And there's a lot of pageantry, and there's just a lot of information. I also teach international relations and political science. One of the most prominent and oldest of the schools of international relations is known as realism. Realism is skeptical about human nature. It sees the realities of politics as chaotic and mysterious and unpredictable. It sees survival as the highest, sometimes the only good. Due to the lawlessness, the breakdown of order in traditional relationships, some due to the Black Death that carried off millions and transformed economic structures, survival became an obsession among royalty, the nobility, and common people alike in late medieval England. When I was an undergraduate, for decades historians had seen these last Plantagenets as a sort of degenerate set of figures, looking backward, unable to grasp the truths of a dawning modern age. Later in the 20th century, historians began to question this all too neat division of medieval and modern. As a young scholar on the cusp of this historiographic conversation, I have both an intellectual interest and I gathered an emotional investment in the discussion. Certainly it used to be that people thought that the Middle Ages ended with Richard III's death, and as if by magic, Henry VII not only became the first Tudor monarch, but the first modern monarch. It's as if someone came out on the field of Bosworth and unfurled a banner over Richard's corpse that said, "Welcome to early modern England." Well, that just isn't the case. My own study, following the footsteps of many others, shows that the 15th century had a good deal of the early modern, and the Tudor age had a lot of the medieval. Tudor civil servants had served the Plantagenets, and even those who were new owed new practices to experiments tried under the last Yorkist kings, Edward IV and Richard III. In addition, much of the English ways of the countryside persisted, as we know, even up until the Great War. So certainly the Tudor period had much of its struggle around continuity and change, particularly when it came to religion. The notion of spirituality, allegiance to local church institutions, including the monasteries, pillaged and shut down by Henry VIII, spans the period of the Plantagenets from the translation of the Bible into English in the late 1300s through the beheading of the most prominent Plantagenet to survive into the Tudor period, Margaret Pole, a woman beheaded as much for her allegiance to Roman Catholicism as well as for her superior descent from Edward III. In fact, her son, Reginald Cardinal Pole, was Mary I's primary advisor in reestablishing Roman Catholicism in the 1550s. So certainly continuity and change both describe what we will be talking about today. To perform a proper beginning, we have to start at the inception of Norman rule. After Hastings in 1066 and the end of the Anglo-Saxon age, the Normans brought their own stamp of rule to England. In 1154, with the accession of Henry II, the Angevin or Plantagenet kings, the word Plantagenet coming from the yellow flower or Plantagenet of Geoffrey of Anjou, the founder of the line, that's when the Plantagenet age begins. Henry II, suitably enough, was a strong, vigorous, aggressive monarch, eager to gain a monopoly of power, a coercive power over his realm, not simply through his personality and the levers of control, but through royal law and the royal courts. As you may know from the movies Becket and A Lion in Winter, if you've been fortunate enough to see them, Henry was passionate about spreading the cohesiveness of royal justice, not just to the nobility and among the commons, but also through the church courts. The notion that parallel clerical courts with an allegiance to essentially political power outside England was a problem that would bedevil English monarchs right through the Tudor period. Henry II was the perfect person to initiate this paradigm of royal sovereignty, a kind of monopoly on coercion. So much, as we shall see, depended not just on the institutions and nominal power of the king and the almost sacerdotal, quasi-priestly, mysterious quality of his rule, but the force and personality and strength of a particular king's personality. Without the force of that personality, his design to maintain order and justice through his institutions would only go so far, because the final ingredient to a stable reign, respect, would not be present. We tend to view royal power through the prism of seemingly inevitable representative government. But if you consider the endemic disorder of these centuries, the only way that a representative government could come about was to have a tyrannical sovereign power that in moments of weakness allowed the creeping need for the power of the purse, such that Parliament could slowly advance as a parallel institution. As a political thinker educating college students, I insist on informing them repeatedly that royal power evolving over centuries, sometimes slowly and sometimes in fits and starts, accumulating a monopoly on coercive power was an inevitable requirement in the growth of representative government. Only a government with the ability to be tyrannical, due to its ability to marshal all levers of power, could then, in turn, be tempered by representative organs such as a parliament. Seen in this light, the Magna Carta may not be a, quote, cornerstone of democracy, but instead it's a very specific contract between King John and his barons, and possibly, from our modern eyes, a setback for the progression to representative government, because it's a weakening of the royal power necessary that must monopolize control in order to then, in turn, be tempered by representative institutions such as a parliament. So despite institutional change and intention, weak kings would inevitably cause regression for the cause of royal domination. However, we must be cautious in simply agreeing with contemporary chroniclers who, like aristocrats and commons alike, viewed monarchs without the common touch as weak or ineffective. This problematic characterization is particularly an issue in grappling with the problems that swirled and still swirl to this day among historians around the figure of Richard II. In addition to the traditional view of kings as a problem in historical assessment, the era of the late Middle Ages contains a number of ironies. First of all, even the strongest kings attempted to set up, quote, new men among the great peers, new allies who would be loyal only to the king, and so be a counterweight to the older aristocracy. As a result, factionalism was inevitable. Second, the king needed a responsive aristocracy to be his representatives at the local level to enforce his laws, keep order, act on his behalf, and keep a kind of social control. Third, and most ironic of all, because the aristocracy respected kingship and relied on it so much themselves, the peers hated the specter of a weak king and were tempted to either control or intimidate those kings they perceived as weaklings, sometimes even to overthrow them. We will see all these issues repeatedly through the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Institutional pressures acting as a backdrop to the personalities that we will highlight. The interaction between the king and his peerage is not enough to examine. For a fuller picture of royal power, the success of society and institutions, and the evolution of government during the period we are examining, we need to continually review the subtleties of faction and royal leadership. Finally, a relatively new pressure added to those above, the onslaught of descendants of a strong king's progeny and bloodline, and the claims and counterclaims of descent and blood added to the issues of the poor and weak kingship, as well as overmighty subjects. Edward III himself, a successful king because he fought effectively to reestablish English influence and control in France, escaped the almost disastrous shadow of his father, Edward II. Edward II, perceived as one of the weakest of Plantagenets, supposedly effeminate, involved with an insufficiently aristocratic favorite, overthrown and murdered by a high nobleman who was having an affair with the queen, is an indication of the dynamic of medieval kingship, regardless of which dynasty, so dependent on particularly traditional masculine qualities, skillful leadership, and charisma, a dynamic that moves between ineffective and more effective kings over hundreds of years. In the case of Edward II, he provided effective of Edward III, he provided effective leadership in ways that both nobles and commons respected. But the combination of his large family and a breakdown of English society in every way, much of it due to the Black Death, meant a mixed legacy. Let's look at the genealogy that you have as a handout and see one of the issues that played out through the Wars of the Roses. Competing bloodlines that made these disputes a family quarrel, not just because of the royal lines, but because the great aristocrats married descendants of these royal heirs and then married each other. So first cousins and sometimes even brothers faced each other across battlefields. Note that Edward III's oldest son, Edward the Black Prince, so named because of the color of his armor, was, from a military point of view, all that such a warlike monarch as Edward III could want as an heir. But his early death, before Edward III's own death, made the contrast between Edward III and the decidedly non-warlike Richard II, his grandson, even greater. Meanwhile, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, known for nothing more than his towering height, the second son, left behind a daughter as an heir, and that descent will become key later in our discussion. John of Gaunt, or Ghent, in Belgium, that's where he was born, Duke of Lancaster, was successful in inheriting the lands of Lancaster due to his spectacular first marriage. And had he been the first son, he would have been a remarkable monarch because of his ambition and the force of his personality. Edmund, Duke of York, the next son, was not a notable figure. His only achievement, his passive role as regent, while Richard II made his fateful expedition to Ireland in 1399. Edmund left behind two sons who provided a future inheritance that would be important also in today's conversation. Finally, Thomas of Woodstock had his own role to play, both in Richard II's reign, as well as providing the House of Buckingham, through the alliance with the Stafford family, prominence and a royal descent. So, again, the genealogy, as mentioned before, will be primarily talking first about the descendants of the senior line, working through the practice of primogeniture, meaning the first son of the first son attains power. So Edward III's oldest son, Edward the Black Prince, dies before his father. Hence, his son, Richard II, becomes king after Edward III's death. Edward III's grandson, in fact, is overthrown by the Duke of Lancaster, the middle son's son. And this is where it gets interesting, and we'll go through this in depth in a few minutes. The grandson of Richard II's supplanter is in turn overthrown by the son of the most overmighty subject of all, a man who unites the second and the fourth lines of Edward III through both female and male lines. Finally, the Tudors, through a very tenuous Lancastrian claim, bring the entire process to a close. Richard II of England, ruling from 1377 through 1399. A weak king, a misjudged king. On the left, you see a picture of the young Richard II, probably before he had reached his majority, while he's still under wardship of his council. And on the right, the more mature Richard, probably after 1390. Popular historians have tended not to be kind to Richard II. He's not interested in warfare, but instead patronage of arts and letters. He attempts to assert royal control through a band of mercenaries and a concentration of power through favorites despised by the older aristocracy. He also attempts to get revenge on those aristocrats who took advantage of him as a child. So we can view him simply as a weak king, or take the more balanced approach of institutional scholars who look at him as simply trying, as all kings did, to strengthen royal control, though not necessarily going about that assertion of control in the most effective way. Certainly calling him a tyrant, as some of his aristocratic foes did, is problematic. He's simply trying to gain the control he felt he needed for his maximum effectiveness. We will certainly talk about the aristocratic factionalism that swirled around Richard II, as it swirled around most kings. We should at the outset mention that resentment from the last years of Edward III's reign existed in the Commons, in Parliament, and some of the doubts expressed about the king's counselors. In these early years, counselors that the king, young Richard, had no control over. The Commons' fears and worries about the security of the realm due to new attacks from Flanders and France against the southern ports are best expressed in the words of one of the most famous poets of the age, William Langland, who wrote the work known as Piers the Plowman. Quote, "Woe to the land in which a boy is king." At the same time, the Commons found the young king blameless because of his youth, his apparent innocence. They found him initially an appealing figure and a source of hope. But the boy king's government faced enormous challenges. The French, defeated by both the young Edward III as well as Edward the Black Prince, Richard's father, had counterattacked so successfully that they not only had recovered their own territory, they had brought the fight to the English ports. Richard succeeded his grandfather at the age of 10, and the greatest challenge for the young Richard was a domestic threat, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The revolt came from economic grievances, stemming from the upheaval in economic relationships from the Black Death. Concerns that the law itself was being manipulated by the newly emboldened and influential class of lawyers. Parliament was basically made up of both upper middle class merchants and lawyers. So even those who were not noble are in fact split among those who are very poor, peasants and farmers, and those who have means and, due to the law, have influence. So lawyers are a particular target of the revolt, and a number of prominent ones lose their lives during the Peasants' Revolt. In addition, anxiety concerning both national security and also human security existed in all manner of ways. Leadership had both an economic and political component, but also a quasi-spiritual and religious one of this revolt. And one of the leaders is a former priest named John Ball. And he said, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentle man?" So this is basically saying, is our class structure really something that we should continue? This is obviously a questioning of social relationships. So this is unprecedented crisis, the Peasants' Revolt, this uprising under surprisingly active and skilled leadership from the Commons, stems from a number of causes. But it also had roots in high taxes and the corrupt behavior of a number of officials. Richard utilized the blank slate that he represented to his people, a kind of potential innocent repository of their hopes for better times, and he instinctively rose to the occasion. Not necessarily to work directly to answer the people's grievances, but to stabilize a situation that could have become a source of unprecedented violence and instability. The Commons, who were active in Parliament, by and large were upper middle class merchants and above all lawyers. However, those active in the Peasants' Revolt were poor farmers and laborers. They called themselves the true Commons, and they seemed to yearn for a direct relationship with their king, without the intervening social layers that traditionally interposed between the apex of society and society's very bottom. Richard showed greater bravery while still in his teens during the crisis, negotiating with the revolt leadership and keeping a cooler head than, surprisingly, the older and more mature aristocrats around him. Eventually, the rebellion fizzles out. Unfortunately for Richard, the next crisis was more damaging to himself and his kingship. His favorites at court included both the royal uncles, but more problematic, some more obscure nobles that he had advanced, other non-noble ministers of merit. The 5 appellants were a group of high nobility, attempting to force themselves into a position of controlling the king. They raised an army against the king and his chief counselors. The appellants successfully won the battle that came about, and under the influence of the appellants, they brought about the, quote, merciless parliament, which met and sanctioned the execution, banishment, or life imprisonment of those counselors closest to Richard. Richard never forgot his humiliation and the death of those he considered close and loyal servants. In turn, the appellants who almost opposed Richard despised the young king for his apparent disregard for his natural counselors, Richard's non-interest in warfare, and other traditional manly pursuits, as well as Richard's preference for poets and artists at court. In time, however, the appellants themselves fell out with each other, and while Richard did not necessarily view his natural counselors with any favor, some of the splintering of his opposition helped him in the years ahead. In 1389, Richard comes into his majority. He's able to rule on his own, though he certainly needs the right kind of counsel. At the same time, his uncle John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, comes home from his time abroad in Spain, where through an advantageous second marriage, he thought he could become King of Castile. After fruitless efforts to gain that position, he decides to come home and he quietly mentors his royal nephew, bringing a decade of relatively quiet and stable years in Richard's reign. While complaints about Richard, his untraditional model of kingship, never ceased, he also had to cope with the lawlessness that marked England in the late Middle Ages for a number of reasons. Landowners and merchants suddenly found that due to the Black Death, the number of laborers available for menial labor had suddenly and dramatically shrunk, allowing for a surprising rise in wages. The market pressure brought retaliation from those with capital, trying to control those new wages with legal remedies. At the same time, social unrest and violence, sometimes anti-clerical, brought peer fighting peer for advantage, or groups of the commons rising to combat grievances. This marked the English landscape for the next decades, regardless of the identity and actions of any particular king. For even the most dispassionate observer, Richard's actions as king present a mixed success. Richard showed effectiveness in making use of new kinds of taxes that yielded surprising amounts of revenue to the crown. But at the same time, due to a lack of perhaps emotional intelligence, he tended to spend that extra income, rather than find ways to use it to rebate that money via Parliament, something that would have rebounded to his credit and helped bridge the gap between him and an insecure Commons. He also tended to spend money on great patronage of the arts, which, while satisfying to us in retrospect, was not something that was seen as traditional for an English king. Richard also used his preference for peace in a way to make real gains in crown income, because he was simply not spending money on French adventures anymore. However, this lack of martial ambition, even with its material gains, was looked at suspiciously by the warlike English population, who, hearing a rumor that Richard might in fact be renouncing his hereditary claim on the French throne, rallied in a mass protest later on in his realm. Now we must return to the main thrust of this talk, the relationship between Richard and the great peerage. By the late 1390s, Richard felt strong enough to get revenge on several of the Lords appellant who had humiliated him years before. He killed or imprisoned 3 of them, the Earl of Arundel, his uncle Thomas of Woodstock, Earl of Gloucester, and the Earl of Warwick. Meanwhile, the 2 remaining appellants, the Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Hereford, John of Gaunt's son, accused each other of conspiring against Richard, and Richard used this opportunity to exile both of them for life. John of Gaunt, heartbroken at his son's exile, dies. Richard promotes a number of new aristocrats to help consolidate his power and forms a band of his own retainers, as his nobles did, drawn from the county of Chester, dresses them in green and gives them a badge of the White Hart. Unfortunately, Richard's open preference for both the county of Chester as well as Wales left him stripped of popular favor at a time when he was about to force the next and the last great showdown with the great peers. Hence, his reputation for tyranny extends not just to the peerage, antagonized by the intimidation of the Chester archers. The open example of these royal retainers adds to his unfavorable image among the commons. At this critical venture, he takes the Duke of Lancaster's lands rightfully belonging to John of Gaunt's son, now exiled. In 1399, while the exiled Henry, pious and a great warrior, makes the rounds of courts in Europe, Richard decides that he must make an example of the Irish revolting against their English overlords and mounts perhaps the first expedition of his military under his personal command. Hundreds of years later, it's hard to fathom his rationale for leaving the country as he did. Whether or not he felt so secure that nothing could happen in his absence, or that he had simply become oblivious to his unpopularity, we will never know. At any rate, Richard must not have been totally unaware of his vulnerability, because he takes with him the exiled Henry of Lancaster's son, young Henry of Monmouth, as a hostage on the Irish expedition. Richard leaves his ineffectual uncle, Edmund, Duke of York, as regent in his absence from England. At this point, Henry, the exiled son of John of Gaunt, waits until Richard has left for Ireland to land on the east coast of England, a place in Yorkshire on the North Sea called Ravenspur. He claims he has only returned to get back the Lancaster lands, but as his strength grows because of popular and baronial disdain for Richard, plus the close support of Henry Percy, 1st Earl of Northumberland, Ralph Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland, and the other prominent lords in the realm, combined with the inactivity of Edmund, Duke of York, entrusted with security in Richard's absence, Henry makes it clear he means to overthrow Richard and rule in his place. Richard, suddenly aware of the threat to his power, returns to England through Wales. His few soldiers melt away as he lands. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, persuades Richard to give himself up, and Richard finds himself isolated, outnumbered. So he does surrender, but once in Henry's control, Richard never experiences freedom again. Despite efforts, almost successful, by the loyalists of the county of Chester to rescue Richard before his trial and deposition, Richard not only loses his kingship by act of Parliament under the control of Henry of Lancaster, he is imprisoned and dies, perhaps by starving himself to death, perhaps due to murder. While Henry, now Henry IV, promptly shows the body to make sure everyone knows Richard is dead, for years supposed sightings of Richard are spoken of around England, suggesting how spooked the entire realm is by the frightening act of deposing an anointed king. This precedent remains high in men's minds for the decades to come and becomes a model of sorts very quickly. Henry IV, King of England. Henry, who has recovered his Duchy of Lancaster and is now King Henry IV, is a more traditional royal figure. He's a warrior, not the unusual patron of the arts as Richard was, and a more orthodox religious figure. Henry, in fact, used religious orthodoxy as a means to test loyalty to his own reign, while Richard had at least tolerated the translating of the scripture from Latin into English by John Wycliffe and the proliferation of the poor priests who preached around England without church sanction, known as the Lollards. Henry IV and later his son Henry V had no compunction about burning heretics at the stake. One of Henry's great advantages was ready access to the resources, the revenue, and in particular of the Duchy of Lancaster. It was almost an empire inside a kingship. Such resources helped because the new role of Parliament, an active partner in Richard's deposition, now demanded greater financial discipline from the king. The first years of Henry's reign were shadowed by, as mentioned before, rumors of Richard's survival. And in Richard's name, several risings, though unsuccessful, created an instability that never left the reign of Henry IV entirely. In addition, Richard, childless, had named his Mortimer cousin, the Earl of March, with royal blood through the daughter of Lionel of Clarence, the second son of Edward III, as his successor. When the Earl of March was captured by the Welsh, Henry, concerned about the Mortimer claim to his own throne, does not ransom him. Henry IV's early years are marked by instability and rebellion. Henry's allies in becoming king, particularly the Percy family, hereditary lords of Northumberland and wardens of the West March, decide that Henry has not rewarded them enough for their help in placing Henry on the throne. I've included some of the badges here. The one on the left is the badge of the Percys. Their stronghold of Alnwick Castle, which still exists and is still in the Percy today, is the picture of the middle slide. Not only is Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, become a foe of Henry, but he is assisted in this by his brother, the Earl of Worcester, and most notably by Henry Percy the Younger, known to history and through lovers of Shakespeare as Hotspur, the greatest English warrior of his day. Meanwhile, these disaffected aristocrats link up with Owen Glendower. And this is Owen's shield on the right, and also a picture of him on a horse. He declares himself a new kind of king of Wales. He's a Welsh landowner that had been favored by Richard II, but now he's an opponent of Henry IV. He leads an uprising in Wales against Henry. Glendower has grievances against one of Henry's supporters, Lord Grey of Ruthin. He's a neighbor of Glendower, who has entered into a dispute with the Welshman. Not surprisingly, Henry favors the Englishman Ruthven. Glendower burns Ruthin's lands, captures him, and begins a rebellion against Henry. A rebellion joined by Welshmen not just in Wales, but even those who are studying at English universities, who make their way quietly west to join the rising. Owen Glendower has captured Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, a claimant to the throne that Henry refuses to ransom. Mortimer marries Glendower's daughter and joins Glendower's rebellion. Mortimer's sister, meanwhile, is married to the younger Henry Percy Hotspur. So through these alliances, the crisis worsens, and Henry IV's son, young Henry, the Prince of Wales, a young boy, is under siege by the rebels on the Welsh border, and his father marches an army to rescue him. In 1403, a battle between the rebels and the king, the Battle of Shrewsbury, results in the killing of Hotspur and Worcester, the retreat of Glendower back into Wales, and the isolation of the Earl of Northumberland, who was killed some years later in the north. Glendower remains a threat for years, but he never has the potential again to strike at the heart of Henry's power. Finally, he simply disappears and the Welsh movement for independence fades away. Despite troubles from time to time, Henry IV's rule is never so seriously threatened again. While Henry's reign was never free of discord, his skillful management of his resources and his patronage and attention to significant members of Parliament helped solidify his rule. The second phase, after the Battle of Shrewsbury of Henry's rule, troubles continue around the habitual concerns of kings, namely revenue, as well as Henry's deteriorating health. As his son Henry, Prince of Wales, gains in years and experience, he begins to act on the king's behalf from time to time, sometimes with the king's sanction, sometimes not. The greatest threat towards the end of Henry IV's rule is, in fact, the discord between the king and his oldest son, the Prince of Wales, young Henry, more and more eager to take power for himself. In fact, towards the end of the elder Henry's reign, he begins to show a preference for, the king begins to show a preference for the younger son, Thomas, later Duke of Clarence. In 1412, Henry IV dies, and his son Henry, known to history, again through Shakespeare as Prince Hal, becomes King Henry V. No medieval king had a more active apprenticeship or was more ready to take the throne than Henry V. An Orthodox Catholic like his father, obsessive about reopening English royal claims in France, he comes to power with an agenda and with great focus. His great nobles rejoiced in the prospect not just of fighting for glory in France, and the prospect of loot through noble French prisoners who, if captured, could bring rich ransoms to English captors. You'll see a couple of pictures here. One is the Battle of Agincourt, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and then down below, the marriage with Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the King of France. A physical prodigy, and like his father, a great warrior, according to legend, so fast of foot he was able to catch deer in the royal estates on foot, decides that he should lead an expedition to enforce the hereditary claim of the kings of England to the throne of France. The 100 Years' War, which starts early in the 1300s, made famous by the battles of Poitiers and Crécy, great English victories, had been in abeyance during the reigns of Richard II and Henry IV. Henry not only marshals the pent-up jingoism of nobles and commons alike in England, he also takes advantage of discord inside the enormous French kingdom. The division between the Duke of Burgundy, with lands in the north, now the Low Countries, and the French king, with the king temporarily removed and his place taken by the Duke of Orleans. Henry leads an army that is tiny by comparison to French forces, but against all odds wins the greatest battle of his generation, the famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415. He utilizes his unarmored longbowmen some of them Welsh, against the mass of French mounted knights who get bogged down in a muddy battlefield, become unhorsed, and are easily killed or taken prisoner. This battle deepens the political crisis in France. As a result, the King of France makes Henry his heir, and Henry marries Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the King of France. Henry's energies, devoted almost entirely to the French campaign, keep him absent from England for much of his reign. At first, successfully riding the energy for war, he finds the need for constant funding and constant personal attention to the French situation saps his own energy and focus, as well as the desires of his countrymen for war. Concerns also arise that such a dual kingdom would place England in subordinate role to France. Finally, in 1422, he catches dysentery in France during yet another campaign, leaving an infant Henry VI as nominal ruler of England under the protection of Henry V's brother, John, Duke of Bedford, the most able of his brothers. This reign, so glorious with victory and apparent promise, leaves England vulnerable during yet another period of a long minority, this time under a king literally in a cradle. The long reign of Henry VI is steeped in violence. His coronation occurs in 1429 when he's 8 years old. Disagreement and ambition swirl around the young Henry at the very top. These issues are at the very top of his administration between John, Duke of Bedford, the regent of the English efforts continuing in France, Henry Beaufort, the king's cousin and the Bishop of Winchester, later Cardinal Beaufort, a skilled and highly placed administrator, and finally Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, Henry VI's youngest uncle, the Lord Protector and young Henry's regent for the rule of England. Like the young Richard II, the young Henry VI, particularly in the 1430s, was given the benefit of the doubt by barons and commons alike. But Henry VI is not particularly interested in royal rule, unlike his ruthlessly dedicated father and grandfather. Like his father and grandfather, he is pious, but unlike them, he is focused on religious life and religious endowment. So personally pious, he reportedly fled a woman at court who he deemed insufficiently modest in dress, shouting, "Fie, fie." I guess fie meant pretty strong talk. In the years ahead, despite Bedford's efforts and those of other English aristocrats, new levies and new resource outlays, the French counterattacks, assisted by the inspirational but abortive leadership of Joan of Arc, France's vastly superior resources, the death of Lord Talbot, English best general, and the increasingly effective French use of cannon bring about a complete reversal of English fortunes. And as a result, there's a storm of criticism and resentment in England, in addition to the arrival back home of disgruntled former soldiers who provide men for the great private baronial armies. The king's family is assisted, but also marked for resentment by the activity of new offshoots of the House of Lancaster, the Beaufort family, from John of Gaunt's mistress and eventual third wife, Catherine Swynford, and their offshoots, the Tudors, who of course we shall learn about later. The Beaufort children were legitimized after their birth, but were barred from the succession. Meanwhile, Owen Tudor, a footman in Henry VI's widow's household, had an affair with her, and the union produced 3 sons. There's some question about whether those sons were legitimate or not at birth. They became legitimate later, and Henry VII becomes the grandchild of that union. The oldest, and this happens because the oldest son, Edmund Tudor, marries Margaret Beaufort, and this provides the man who becomes later Henry VII with a very tenuous tincture of royal blood. Their son, Henry Tudor, to become Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. As previously mentioned, Henry's reign is marked by discord and lawlessness. Worst of all, as an apparently weak figure with the disadvantage of a long minority, Henry VI's court becomes a battleground of factionalism. The first episode of a crisis nature represented a financial collapse of the royal finances. The episode was perceived as a financial scandal. The Duke of Suffolk, the chief minister, and his administration received not only blame, but assault and death as a result. Bad harvests, minor revolts, and more discord, a lack of confidence, and all sorts of negative issues occur with more frequency. In addition, the Queen becomes increasingly the head of the king's party, favoring one of her husband's Beaufort family, the Duke of Somerset, over the traditional nobility, and sparking resentment as a result, particularly in the wake of the money troubles that overshadow this administration. The Queen is Margaret of Anjou. She's a minor French aristocrat. It's not a favorable marriage. She brings very little in the way of a dowry to Henry VI, and she becomes a terrifically divisive figure in the years ahead. But she surprisingly shows great political instincts in terms of rallying the base, and she actually shows some capability on the battlefield as well. So she's a mixed asset to Henry, as we'll say, but she certainly fights as a lion for his rights and those of their son. The disputes over the purse will have fatal consequences for the rule of Henry VI. Just as the latter stages of Richard II's reign have the overmighty members of the House of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, and his son Henry, as potentially troublesome subjects because of their quasi-royal power and resources, Henry VI, too, has such an overmighty subject, a natural rallying point for those who hate the Somerset faction at court and distrust the Queen who heads it. If you look at your genealogy, you will see that Edward III's second son, Lionel, again, famous for only one fact, being perhaps 6'7" tall, which is just, for the Middle Ages, is just, I mean, Charlemagne was supposed to be very tall, and he was maybe 6 feet. So it's just remarkable. Lionel had descendants in the Mortimer family through his daughter. Edward III's fourth son, meanwhile, the Duke of York, also had descendants. Both of these lines unite in the figure of Richard, Duke of York. He inherits through the female line the Mortimer claim, which is senior to that of Lancaster, and through the descent of the fourth son, Edmund of Edward IV, he gains all the lands of the Duchy of York. He is a formidable figure indeed, due to these enormous resources. Richard, Duke of York, Henry VI's cousin and leading subject, has lands in Ireland, Wales, Yorkshire, a great swath of property over much of the Midlands. If that weren't enough, with his own resources, he makes an enormously advantageous marriage to Cicely Neville, whose father, the first Earl of Westmoreland, has enormous land holdings, particularly in the north of England. If York's own resources are enough to threaten Henry's reign, York's alliance with the Neville family makes him strong enough to not only threaten but overthrow the Lancastrian dynasty entirely, which eventually happens. York, in fact, has 4 sons, 2 later to be kings, including Edward, later Edward IV, and Richard, later Richard III. For a time, York, already resented by those at court, is sent to Ireland as the English ruler there and does his best to rule there effectively, despite all the endemic difficulties of the English position in Ireland. But at the end of that assignment, York begins to pursue his ambition and what he sees as his rightful place at court for the rest of his troubled life. York not only becomes the champion of opposition aristocrats, but also the discontented among the commons. A weak king, a fierce but foreign queen, favored but distrusted and resented faction at court, headed by the Duke of Somerset, and an overmighty subject, the Duke of York, the natural champion of the opposition. Finally, the episode that pushes York into active opposition and positions him to profit from the crisis of the 1450s. That is what we will now turn to. By the early 1450s, England has lost all its gains in France. It's as if Agincourt had never happened. The only exception is the port of Calais, excuse me, thinking of Vermont. Calais, in fact, remains in English hands for another probably 100 years, even into the times of the Tudors. And the effect of French fighting lingers even in the English political crises. Years earlier, York, as an active and successful soldier in France, does what most nobles do when they fight abroad. They advance their own money to pay soldiers and ask the royal purse for reimbursement, using a system of matching tally sticks. A pair of sticks used to confirm the legitimacy of royal debt. These sticks actually are identical to each other. They're kind of like a primitive sort of invoice. You present the second stick in order to confirm the legitimacy of the money that you're being asked to be reimbursed for. So York comes to court and basically turns in his tally stick for his service in France, to which he's advanced great sums of money to pay his soldiers there on behalf of the crown. When he comes to make his case for repayment, he's told to wait for reimbursement. And at the same time, he notices that the Duke of Somerset, who's done very little in terms of France or anything else, is able to get money whenever he wants to. York is furious at this. He confronts the king. He says that he has had to mortgage his own personal dinner plate, basically, if you can imagine aristocratic silver plate. He's actually had to use that in order to pay soldiers. He is absolutely furious with the king at this point, and the difficulties he is having in terms, even this probably the richest peer in England, he's having trouble paying his bills, essentially. He's got a cash flow crisis on his hands. This is what pushes him over, basically, from resentment into wanting a change that he can totally control and drive. At this crisis, the king has a nervous breakdown. It turns out that his grandfather, the King of France, the Valois king, had the same malady. It's a kind of, nobody knows exactly what it was, but it meant that he basically was not able to communicate or speak for months at a time. So he becomes incapacitated, he cannot govern. And the thing that happens almost at the same time, the Queen gives birth to their son. So this is an enormous crisis. Richard, Duke of York, is the natural choice as regent, since the king can't rule. And he takes charge of the council, and he packs it with all his supporters, and he turns out all of the Queen's supporters at the same time. When the king regains his mental health, which he does in a period of months, he dismisses York, and he reinstates the members of the Queen's party on the council. So the stage is set for the civil war that is soon to erupt as forces are marshaled on both sides. As we have seen, the problem of the king, whether a traditional figure like Henry VI or a more unusual figure like the Pacific Richard II, is the relationship with the great nobles. The nobles, in turn, support the idea of a king because a strong king who is a worthy leader provides opportunities for royal patronage for the nobles, as well as opportunity for wealth in foreign wars. But a king can be a threat to even the greatest noble, threatening the nobles' lands and an entire dynasty that may have been carefully built up through arranged marriages, management and enlargement of hereditary estates, perhaps over hundreds of years. So, as you can see, security is a paramount concern to both the king and the nobility. While the Wars of the Roses proper are traditionally considered to begin in the middle 1400s, the period we're about to discuss, we cannot consider them without a reference to both Edward III's enormous family and troublesome plethora of descendants, as well as the reign of Richard II. The seizure of the Duchy of Lancaster's lands by Richard II, Richard's overthrow, and the precedent caused by Henry IV's usurping of the throne. In the second talk, beginning in a few minutes, we're going to consider the consequences of some of these early events. We also cannot consider the Wars of the Roses without the structural issues that we have seen as a result of the Black Death, the lawlessness of English society, the new aggressiveness of a lawyer and merchant class now finding its voice in Parliament, the factionalism of the courts, a new anti-clerical temper dating from the 1300s, and other factors. A word about Shakespeare. Obviously, Shakespeare is the 800-pound gorilla in the room in terms of this topic, or whatever kind of beast you want to call it, 800 pounds. Shakespeare's history plays loom large in the popular image of these kings, with unforgettable images from the plays. The effete Richard II, the guilt-ridden and frustrated Henry IV, the hero king Henry V, Prince Hal, the unfortunate and weak but sympathetic Henry VI, finally the villainous Richard III. People who know nothing about the history of this period, if they know anything, they know what they know because they have seen Shakespeare's plays. You can see the red rose of Lancaster on the left, the white rose of York on the right, and of course the bard himself in the middle. And while these emblems, it's unclear from historians how much these emblems really meant to the parties involved. Certainly Shakespeare uses both these badges to great effect, the red rose and the white, and it's a really nice, easy way for people to kind of keep track of people it's really not so easy to keep track of because they change sides a great deal. But anyway, it's part of the color of Shakespeare. And if you ever get a chance to see any of the history plays in person, and you haven't, do it. It's great. Kind of put the history aside and just enjoy the story, because the history isn't always what it should be. I've been fortunate enough to see the history plays. I saw them in the Delacorte Theater, Shakespeare in the Park in New York, and it was phenomenal. I've seen it at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I've seen other local productions. And while they're very exciting, you have to understand that they are done as a reflection of the time in which they're written, the 16th century, and preoccupations with Elizabeth's reign. They also are based on Tudor chronicles that basically take the Lancastrian side in many cases, so they're a distortion in many ways. And so you have to keep that in mind when you're watching them. Shakespeare is dependent on source material available in the early years of the Tudor reign of Henry VII, the first Tudor. Much of it propagandist in its scope and perspective. Thomas More's writings, the Chronicles of Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed, the account of Henry VII's hired historian, Polydore Virgil, biased towards the Lancastrian offshoot, the Tudor dynasty. Triumphalist in its portrayal of inevitable success of Elizabeth I's forebears. While this makes for a cohesive portrayal of the figures involved, it raises thorny problems of historical accuracy. Shakespeare wrote 10 history plays. 2 obscure outliers, Henry VIII and King John, which almost nobody watches and almost nobody puts on. His 8 most famous plays are about the Wars of the Roses. They're 2 tetrarchies, or quartets. Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3 with Richard III is 1 quartet. Very early episodic Shakespeare. Sometimes thought Shakespeare kind of collaborated with a number of people in writing these. But the second quartet that Shakespeare writes, Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V, are masterful products of the mature Shakespeare. But they cover the early part of the historical period. So what's confusing about this is that Shakespeare wrote the plays actually in reverse order of how the chronology actually happened. So as you can see, I'm trying to stay clear of Shakespeare because it just kind of muddies the waters, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it and urge you to see the plays if you ever have a chance. So just a quick, grounding again in some of the issues. Some of it's going to be redundant, for which I apologize in the first part, but I think it's important that we have kind of a basic grounding going forward against which to put the personalities of the time. So, again, my background, not just the fact that I'm a medievalist, but as a political historian, I find that security issues are extremely important no matter what it is that you're talking about, and I don't think it can be overemphasized enough that the late 1300s and the period of the 1400s, security is an issue that is rampant, whether you are the king, you are a high noble, you are the gentry, you are a parliamentarian, or you are a member of the commons. Security is very important to you. Your national security, are the French attacking? Are you going to attack France? Your human security, do you have enough to eat? Are you going to get adequate and fair representation in the law courts? And this is going to be very important in the second part of the talk. We'll talk about issues of the law. If you're a member of the peerage and over hundreds of years through careful stewardship of all your resources and really good alliances, you've accumulated a tremendous amount of property. The concern that you could lose all of it in an instant because you get into a dispute with the king and the king has Parliament pass a law attainting you, in other words, taking away all your properties and basically making you landless. These are enormous issues for the time, and the problem is nobody feels as if they have enough security. And when there's a security imperative that's that obsessive, it's going to bring further feelings of insecurity, which is going to drive real insecurity as well as the perception of insecurity. And that's what so much of this period is about. So I think it's important to say those things. Again, to rehash, Plantagenet comes from Plantagenet, which is a yellow flower, which was one of the signs of Geoffrey of Anjou, who's the founder of the House of Plantagenet before Henry II, the first Plantagenet king, in the 1100s. And again, talking about Henry II, setting the standard of a medieval king who wants to have a monopoly on power, and having that monopoly of power not just through his own human ability to influence events, but also through his courts and all the institutions available to him. And the issue of quote-unquote weak and ineffectual kings, again, some of that is propagandist. If a king is not, what's interesting to me is that when the Tudor age begins, and none of the Tudors ever take the battlefield. I mean, Henry VIII does in kind of laughable, occurrences, but nothing the way the Henrys or Edward and Richard do. But the thing is, somehow the game has changed such that the Henrys and Elizabeth are never judged badly because they don't take the battlefield. Nobody ever holds that against them. So something in the calculus has changed, and that would certainly be an interesting subject matter for another talk. But in the period that we're concentrating on during the 1300s and 1400s, it is important that you be viewed, rightly or wrongly, as someone who is willing to lead your troops in battle, to go on when it makes sense, particularly against the French, and affirm your right to the French throne and maybe capture some. And if you're a high nobleman, you really want to attach yourself to a cause like this, because on the battlefield you can get prisoners and hold them ransom and make enormous amounts of money for yourself, as well as get glory and do what nobles do, which is fight in battles like this. And you can also advance your influence at home by coming back showered in glory, and you have soldiers who have fought for you, and all these things. But again, against all these issues are to me, the most important issue, which is royal control and royal ability to influence all events, not just in terms of institutions, but also by force of personality. We see two long, and we'll talk about this some more, two long minorities, Richard II's minority and Henry VI's minority, which literally starts in the cradle, basically. And these are enormous issues in terms of coercive power and royal influence, and putting people at a disadvantage. And the thing that nobles don't like is any sense of unpredictability. When you've got a child king, it's insecurity for everybody. So again, just to recap, looking at your genealogy, if you have it handy, Richard, Duke of York is basically, if you start with Lionel, Duke of Clarence, right underneath Edward III, Lionel, Duke of Clarence is the second son of Edward III. And it's hard to tell, because if you go over to two more sons to Edmund of Langley, actually Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and Anne Mortimer, marrying Anne Mortimer, that basically that unites bloodlines 2 and 4, and those unite in the person of Richard, Duke of York, down here. That is the key for this discussion. He basically unites these two claims, one of them through the female line, senior to the Lancastrian line, the Lancastrians who have been kings since Henry IV, but getting much of his property and the dukedom of York from the male line over there. So that's basically where we are with this overmighty subject, who has both legitimacy and he's got a lot of land. And he's got the precedent of the overthrow of Richard II, which is going to become key as we continue. So, to recap, two great factions, as it were. A volatile queen, Margaret of Anjou, and the person of the Duke of Somerset, who is a Beaufort, who is killed fairly early on in some of the skirmishing before the big battles begin. But his son and his nephew carry on the tradition of being the Queen's champions and those closest to King Henry VI. York, the York party, is the other party. And York is seconded, not only is he enormously strong in and of his own resources, he's married to one of the biggest landowning families in England, the Neville family. What's interesting about this is if you do some of the reading behind the scenes, York and Neville, despite that marriage, were not always together. There are a couple of remarkable scholarly books that talk about this that I'll summarize for you. That initially, York and Neville were on opposite sides because, remember I mentioned to you in the first part of the talk about the tally sticks and York having to wait to get his bills paid, meaning this enormous cash flow problem. The Nevilles didn't have that problem. So for a long time, Neville and York, despite their kinship, despite the marriage alliances and everything else, they didn't really have the same sense of urgency around Henry VI's administration. But something changes. Someone in Henry VI's administration, or a series of accidents or whatever, suddenly puts the Nevilles on the outside. Suddenly their great rivals, the Percys, Earls of Northumberland, start getting preference at court. And the Nevilles start getting shut out. So all of a sudden, the Percys, who had been shut out and were more likely to follow York just because they're on the outs, suddenly they get preference. Suddenly they're in the in crowd, and they are closer to Margaret of Anjou, and suddenly the Nevilles are on the outs. And suddenly Neville and York are not only together in terms of affinity and an advantageous marriage, they now suddenly have similar interests. They are on the outs, they're having trouble getting their bills paid. So they have the same sudden shared sense of urgency. And it's this alliance that is key in having the strength to actually topple Henry VI when we get to it. So the king's health, the king having a breakdown, financial control and patronage being an issue, and the vitriol around Margaret of Anjou is such that there are any number of people, aristocrats and not, who are quite happy to say that, well, this child that she supposedly had with Henry VI is really from somebody else, like maybe Somerset, that Henry VI it just didn't happen. So this canard that has no basis in fact, but this scurrilous rumor is out there for a long time. Now, before we get back to the personalities, there is one structural factor that we have to spend time with. And basically, it's known as bastard feudalism. And what it basically means is that the nature of raising armies in the late Middle Ages changes in England. The king has no standing army. The king is dependent on the great lords and their followers for raising an army. So there's this term, bastard feudalism means it's a new kind of feudalism, basically, and it's based more on money and contacts and patronage than it is on kind of the older systems. What you really need to know is that there's something called maintenance and livery. If you look at the second bullet, the great lords maintain lower men in local courts. Remember a few minutes ago I was talking about a lack of security. You're worried that if you go to court, it doesn't matter if your cause is just or not. You're worried that somebody else will have somebody stronger there who's acting against you. So you want to make sure you have as high an aristocrat as possible who's your protector, your patron, basically. This series of kind of shifting alliances. So great lords maintain lower men. Great lords basically will pack courts or use their influence because they're officers of the king in a particular shire or a particular county. So in return, what happens on the other side of the equation? Your clients wear your livery, like your white rose or red rose or whatever it is that your badge is. And these lower people bring their followers to fight for you, the great lord, in return for the great lord helping them in court. So these high aristocrats, maybe 10 of the great earls and dukes of the realm, they can raise maybe 5 or even 10,000 soldiers, which is an enormous amount for those days. Again, there's no royal standing army, so the king is absolutely dependent on getting high aristocrats who can muster these private armies to support them. There are also soldiers who have come back. There's controversy about whether all the soldiers who were unsuccessful in France who've come home, whether they now are joining up these private armies. Some scholars think that that's a big part of the lawlessness during this period. These unemployed soldiers have come home. They don't know anything else but fighting, and that there are lords who are eager to employ them in order to maintain and advance their interests. So this is an issue that's very important. And if you look back at Richard II and his badge of the White Hart, it was unprecedented for the king to have basically his own livery and with his own people fighting that way. It was one of the things that makes him notable in that sense. So, now, back to our personalities. 1455, the first real battle. It's not much of a battle, but it's the first thing you can kind of dignify in that. War breaks out, the Battle of St. Albans. York and the Nevilles are on one side, and the king is kind of tagging along because he doesn't really know what he's doing at this point. But the queen, basically, and the nobles on her side have an army in Northampton. York and the Nevilles have a more experienced army. They have more French soldiers with them, and it's a larger army, and they tend to be more aggressive. One of the Nevilles actually sneaks in behind the lines. The king is wounded, I don't think by design, but several of the high nobles on the Lancastrian side are killed, basically. Notably, Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford, both prominent northern lords, they're killed, and this will have significance some years later. The king himself is wounded, he hides, the Yorkists find him, they bandage him up, they apologize profusely because they've basically committed treason. They've been in arms against him, and he's been wounded by them. So at this point, the Yorkists still protest that they mean no harm to Henry VI, but it's getting harder and harder for them to say, we don't mean any harm to the king, we just wished he'd replace the people around him, preferably with us. Over the next 5 years, against the odds, despite feints and challenges and attempts at reconciliation that don't work, the vendetta gets worse and worse. Finally, in 1460, no turning back, York actually comes into the throne room. The king is not there at this point. He walks over to the throne and makes as if to sit in it. Even for York's own supporters, this is too much. They visibly go just like this. They can't believe it. And York just realized suddenly he's made this enormous political mistake. So he doesn't think he's in the wrong. He just thinks, wow, I handled that really badly. He's got the claim for it, but the precedent would be enormous. So what does he do? He retreats. He goes up to Yorkshire, to Sandal Castle, to one of his places. He takes with him his brother-in-law, the Earl of Salisbury, Richard Neville, the head of the Neville family. He also takes with him his second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland. And in December of 1460, they are enticed out of Sandal Castle by a superior Lancastrian army, and York and Neville are defeated badly and killed. And not only are they overwhelmed and the principal Yorkists die, but the son of the Lord Clifford, who was killed in Northampton, basically goes up to Edmund, Earl of Rutland, York's son, and basically stabs him at the end of the battle. I mean, all the fighting's done. He's unarmed at this point. He just stabs him. He says, your father killed mine, so I'm going to kill you. So this is now not just about factionalism and about keeping power and taking power and getting your bills paid. This is now about vendetta and a blood feud at this point as well. And this is how it escalates. So the end of 1460 seems to be a very bad time for the Yorkists, but their fortunes are about to take a very surprising turn. And with that, we will be in our discussion of Edward IV, King of England. And in 1461, this man, Edward IV, the Earl of York's oldest son, he's a remarkable man. He has inherited his forebear Lionel's height. He's about 6'4", which is probably just unprecedentedly tall for that time and period. Apparently, he's extremely handsome, very smart, the best soldier without a doubt of his generation, which he proves again and again on domestic battlefields, and a quick study, and emotionally extremely intelligent. All those things. So he is the Earl of March. He's the oldest son of the Duke of York, and he becomes head of the House of York when his father dies. in December 1460. At this point, Edward has a Yorkist army on the Welsh border, and he meets up a Lancastrian force that has among its leaders Owen Tudor, the old man who had had a liaison with Catherine of Aragon and had those quasi-legitimate Tudor kids some years earlier. He dies on the battlefield, and his son Jasper Tudor, who's a Lancastrian general, escapes. And Edward wins a great battle. One of the things about the battle, it's called Mortimer's Cross. And the reason people talk about it today is because there's what's known as a perihelion, this site of 3 suns. Edward sees it, and because he had such presence, he basically said, you know, he points at the perihelion and he said, this will be a victory for York. It's kind of like what Constantine does in 300 when he wins his battle to gain domination of the Roman Empire. And that's why he adopts the badge, the sun in splendor, in commemoration of this moment, his first victory on the battlefield. At this point, he comes to London, and he and his most important supporter, Warwick, Richard Warwick, Earl of Neville, who's now the House of Neville because his father, too, was killed at Sandal Castle. They basically connect, and they make the decision, you know what, we're not going to fool around anymore. Edward is going to be crowned. He's got a superior right. So he takes possession of the crown, and he marches north to fight the Lancastrian army that is still marching around northern England that had killed his father and his uncle some months earlier. On Easter Sunday, in a terrific snowstorm, they meet at the Battle of Towton in Yorkshire, and it is the largest battle by number of combatants ever fought on English soil. There are estimates as high as perhaps 25,000 killed on that battlefield. York is triumphant. Edward is all over the battlefield fighting. Margaret of Anjou and her infant son are forced to flee. They go into Scotland and they get over to France, where they stay for the next decade. Henry VI wanders kind of aimlessly around the north of England and finally is captured by the Yorkists and put for safekeeping in the Tower of London. And Edward and Warwick return to London in triumph to dispose of the spoils and award patronage and a new Yorkist government. So Edward's, and Warwick is known as the Kingmaker because he is instrumental in being kind of the power behind the throne of Edward's new reign. Edward is also assisted by his 2 younger brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, who's probably about 15 years old, and young Richard, who will eventually become Richard III, who's probably about 10 at this point. So as I said before, Edward is terrifically charismatic. He's tall and handsome, and he's got everything going for him, basically. And this is something, if you saw The White Queen or if you read the books, this is stuff that will start to become familiar to you. So Edward has taken power, and there are basically kind of 2 chapters to his reign. The first chapter kind of ends in 1470, and I'll explain to you why in a few minutes. Edward, at first, is initially quite happy to have the tutelage of the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, but eventually, because he's so smart and he's got such a strong will in his own right, he wants to try and break away from Warwick's domination. So while Warwick is basically negotiating with the French king, Louis XI, to get Louis's daughter to marry young Edward, Edward basically goes off and marries somebody else, and she's not even a high aristocrat. Elizabeth Woodville is her name. She's the widow of a minor lord who, ironically, was a Lancastrian who was killed in one of the battles. He just looks at her. He just thinks she's great. He falls in love with her, and she says, "You must marry me, you know, otherwise I won't, you know, whatever." So he marries her. The only thing to recommend her, it's not really a recommendation, she has this enormous family. They're all quite acquisitive. And Warwick, as you might imagine, is furious. He's furious that Edward has married a woman who has no dowry. She doesn't bring anything at all except this large and acquisitive family, an ambitious family. And what's worse is Warwick has been doing all this work trying to negotiate a French marriage, and now he's been totally humiliated. He's the laughingstock of the French court. So Warwick tries to bide his time. He's not happy at the situation because Edward has now distanced himself. He's shown some independence because he's now got a party at court that's not beholden to Warwick. Basically this Woodville family, and they're snapping up stuff right and left. And in fact, they are so acquisitive that they not only begin to one of the Woodville sisters marries the very young rich Duke of Buckingham with his vast holdings on the border of Wales. One of Edward's brothers actually marries the 80-year-old Dowager Duchess of Norfolk for her lands, which is a great scandal even for that acquisitive age. So they wasted no time in trying to get as much money as they possibly could. But Warwick has some advantages in this kind of coming showdown. Basically, he's got the training of both of Edward's young brothers in the north at his stronghold at Middleham Castle. And not only that, but he's got two daughters, and he wants Edward's two brothers to marry the two daughters, which actually is what happens, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So the feud between Edward and Warwick deepens. And eventually he lures Edward out of London. He captures him, basically, for a period of weeks through an entire summer in the late 1460s. He forces Edward to sign a number of documents promoting some of Warwick's followers. Meanwhile, Warwick has captured a number of the Woodvilles and just executes them without trial because it's time to settle scores, as far as he's concerned. But as the summer wears on, Warwick is finding more and more that he can't do very many things in the king's name without having the king actually out there supporting him. So eventually the game is basically up later in the summer. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and some other nobles come and liberate the king. Warwick has realized this game is up. Unless he's prepared to kill Edward, which he's not prepared to do, he's got to basically let him go. So he does this. But at this point, as you might imagine, reconciliation is impossible. So Warwick basically flees to France, to the court of Louis XI, who is his great friend. He goes there, and his oldest daughter, Isabel, marries George, Duke of Clarence. Both Clarence and Warwick at this point are tainted, which means they're outlaws, basically. They're in France. And so they are declared traitors. And now comes one of the most interesting turns of all. Persuaded by the smooth and artful Louis XI of France to do the unthinkable, Warwick goes to Margaret of Anjou, who's been a poor pensioner at the French court all this time, and begs to ally with her. And she keeps him on his knees for 15 minutes begging her in front of Louis, and finally says, all right. I mean, Margaret of Anjou is furious with him because he's one of the authors of all the misfortunes. He's also been one of the ones who spread so many lies about her son not really being her son and all these other things. But finally she says yes, because she realizes this is the only way she's got to have a chance of getting back and having her son, finally get the inheritance that she thinks he deserves, and getting her husband out of the Tower and basically restoring the Lancastrian dynasty. So Louis agrees to help both of them. And in 1470, Warwick, using family connections and a surprising landing in the south of England, catches Edward off guard when Edward's outside of London. Edward, his brother Richard, and a small band of Yorkists are barely able to get on a ship ahead of Warwick's advancing troops. They sail to Burgundy in the Low Countries, where the Duke of Burgundy is married to Edward and Richard's sister. And at this point, probably one of the stranger chapters in English royal history, Warwick actually goes to the Tower and pulls out poor Henry VI, who just, I think his mental state, never very strong, is probably long past the point where he even knows who anybody is. He pulls him out and crowns him, and Henry is so unstable that they have to kind of pull his horse through the streets. Somebody has to walk with it and pull it along. So everybody knows that this is kind of a sham. And Warwick is basically waiting for Marguerite to show up with the young son, who everybody thinks will be the savior of the Lancastrian line, but she doesn't leave France. So the Yorkists basically flee, if they can, those that didn't join Edward in Burgundy. His queen, Elizabeth, flees to Westminster and takes sanctuary in the Abbey. And nobody knows it, but she's pregnant with the child who's going to be the first son of Edward. And Edward and Richard spend a very unhappy and difficult and stressful winter in Burgundy, trying to get resources from the Duke of Burgundy to make a landing and come back. So eventually, they do persuade the Duke of Burgundy to give them just enough help with a couple of ships to make a small landing back in England. And by the way, I should mention that while Warwick is in France, as part of the way to seal the bargain with Marguerite, he takes his younger sister, Anne, and marries her to Edward, the Lancastrian heir. So, ironically, Edward lands at Ravenspur, the same place in the North Sea in Yorkshire where Henry IV had landed years earlier, and he says the same thing that Henry says, that he basically is only there to recover his Duchy of York. He's not interested in being king again. And that gives just enough of a fig leaf for local forces who maybe are not sure if they want to fight him or not, to just leave him be and not try and capture him. So Edward, ever skillful, is able to slip into London, to get around Warwick's army and slip into London, which has always been kindly disposed towards Edward, partially because he owes them a lot of money at this point. If he doesn't get back on the throne, they'll never get their debts paid. And at the same time, his brother George, Duke of Clarence, who's realizing he's useless to Warwick at this point, changes sides and comes back and joins his brothers. And so they meet Warwick at the Battle of Barnet in Oxfordshire. And this is a very close-run battle. It becomes a Yorkist victory, and Warwick is killed at the end of it, but it's a very close-run thing initially because of it's another Easter Sunday battle, interestingly enough. And because of the fog, initially the Yorkists don't discover until it's too late that they're in the middle of a ravine and the Lancastrians have all the high ground, and they have to fight up the hill, and it's very difficult. And at some point, Yorkists on the other side are outflanked, and they basically run away from the battle, and Lancastrian forces pursue them. But when they come back, the battle has shifted, and so when the Lancastrians come back and think that they're fighting Yorkists, they're actually fighting their own troops, and they don't know it. So at this point, Edward, the great warrior, charges because he senses a hesitation in the Lancastrian line. At this point, the entire Lancastrian army collapses, and it becomes a great Yorkist victory. And the Earl of Warwick is killed on the battlefield. So that's part one of this triumphal year of 1471. Meanwhile, Marguerite decides, for whatever reason, that the time has come to sail to England at this point with her son Edward. She lands in the south. She finds that Warwick has died, has been killed in Oxford, and that the Lancastrians have suffered a great defeat. Her son wants to fight Edward of York. Marguerite wants no part of it. She just wants to now turn around and go back to France because she doesn't think that anybody has a chance of fighting against Edward of York because he's such a great general, and Warwick is now dead. So she just doesn't see any point to it. She would rather her son stay alive for another day, basically. But her son and the nobles around her persuade her to try and fight. She says, well, I want to get into Wales. If you can get me into Wales safely and you can find another army there, I may fight. So she marches. She's trying to get to Wales, and Edward is trying to prevent her. She wants to get into Wales and destroy all the bridges so that she can be safe there and decide what her next move will be. But Edward catches her at a small village called Tewkesbury, and they are forced to fight. And this is another army with a lot of nobles basically on both sides. The Lancastrians have a small ambush behind this sort of wooded hill, and they come out initially, but the Yorkists kind of sniff it out, and at first they're surprised by it, but then they push back, and then Edward provides his own ambush And once again, Edward, with the great help of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, his younger brother, they're triumphant. And they basically, the young Lancastrian prince, Edward, is killed in the battle. And Tewkesbury Abbey, where all the nobles, the Lancastrian nobles, go for sanctuary, basically Edward doesn't care. He said, this is not a sanctuary church. Come on out. So he basically hauls all of them out and executes them all. He pardons the common soldiers and sends them back. This is basically it for Marguerite. Her son's dead. You know, all hope for her is pretty much gone. And you wonder what kind of a life she thinks she has ahead of her, and it turns out not much. Edward basically, he wants no part of her. She's no threat to him anymore with her son dead. So he sends her back to France, where she becomes a pensioner, just a poor pensioner for the last few years of her life. So the three sons of the three brothers of the House of York march back to London, and now that Henry VI's son is dead, they can do away with Henry VI. So they do. They kill him and they display his body, so everybody knows he's dead. So this is this great triumph of realpolitik at this point. So this is Edward II, the second phase. He's his own man. He doesn't have a Warwick to worry about anymore. There's no Lancastrian threat anymore. Before long, he has not just one but two sons. When he comes back from Burgundy successfully, his wife presents him with his first son, and he has another son shortly thereafter. The only problem he's got at this point are his two brothers, who are not getting along. You can see the arms of George, Duke of Clarence, the middle son, and the arms of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the oldest son. Their actions are completely different. Richard has been nothing but loyal this entire time. George has turned his coat at a number of occasions, so it's not sure whether or not he can be trusted. Now that Warwick is dead, Warwick's lands are in question. Some of them go to Isabel, who is the Duke of Clarence's daughter, but some of them are in the king's gift to give. What does the king do? He turns around and he gives them to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, because he trusts Richard, number one. Richard has proved himself in battle. He's proved himself loyal. And he basically says to Richard, I want you to rule the north for me, the north of England, to be my representative in the north of England. And so he gives Richard a number of Warwick's old castles, and he sets him up. And to make things even worse for Clarence, who thought he was going to get all these lands on Warwick's death, Richard makes it known that he wants to marry Warwick's younger daughter, Anne. So this little game of cat and mouse begins, because Clarence wants to grab Anne and kind of spirit her away so that marriage can't take place. So the tradition goes that she's hid herself in a tavern in London and pretended she was like a kitchen maid for a while until she could actually be taken to sanctuary. And by all accounts, she and Richard had known each other for years when he was being trained by Warwick in the north of England. So by all reports, it was a happy marriage in that sense. So they get married, and Clarence has to basically, he has to live with it. Richard does what he's been tasked to do. He goes to the north. Because he has so many good connections, because of the years when he grew up with Warwick, and because he also formed his own group of close adherents when he was up there, younger sons of various nobles. He has a good following, and because he married Anne Neville, who's well known because of her father's affinity, he has that Neville connection, which also helps him in the north. So he's well situated to do exactly what Edward wants him to do, which is to keep things quiet in the often wild and woolly north, which he does. Meanwhile, the Duke of Clarence, not such a great story. Clarence continues to intrigue against Edward, and here's one of the stranger chapters in what is a strange story. Isabel Neville, the Duke of Clarence's daughter, the Duke of Clarence's wife dies, and Clarence is so stricken with grief and he becomes basically unbalanced, and he begins to accuse a number of his servants with poisoning his wife with no basis in fact, and he executes them without trial. Edward hears about this and he's furious because he basically feels as if these people were treated unfairly. And he also is furious because George continues to do things against Edward's interest, like campaigning to make marriages abroad that would set him up as a powerful international figure, all kinds of things. He shows himself to be utterly untrustworthy. So finally, with these last actions, Edward throws George in the tower, his own brother, despite pleading of his mother and Richard to let George out. So the question has to be asked, why is it at this point does Edward want to do away with George so badly? I mean, he's tolerated everything else. Is George that much of a threat to him? There are theories that say that George has found out something about Edward that Edward doesn't want to get out. That's one theory. You know, whether it's as a basis in fact or not, nobody will know. What is clear is that despite all attempts at persuasion, Edward is adamant, and he executes Clarence. The tradition is that Clarence got to choose the manner of his death, and he loved to drink. So the tradition is that he drowned in a barrel of his favorite wine, Malmsey wine. Don't know if it's true, but it makes a great story. So now you're basically down to the two sons. Edward decides he's accomplished everything else he wants to do, so he says he's going to revive the war with France. He goes to France, but Louis XI makes him an offer he just can't refuse. He makes this enormous one-time payment to him and says, "I'll give you an annual tribute to." And Edward says, "Works for me." So not only does Edward get this enormous one-time payment with a promise of annuities thereafter, Louis pays every other English nobleman in France at that point. The only one who doesn't take a bribe is Richard. Richard's the only one who doesn't take a bribe. And Richard is furious that they're not actually going to fight. Everybody else says, "That's fine, I'll take the money." So one of the interesting things about this is because Edward gets this money every year from Louis, he doesn't have to call Parliament as much. So it becomes a useful force in terms of Edward's monetary situation. So in Edward's last years, his health and vigor decline in the late 1470s. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is even more indispensable than ever. He needs to fight Scotland, and Edward tries to get on a horse and ride north to personally lead the troops against Scotland, and he doesn't get very far. He says, "Richard, you go deal with it," which Richard does very successfully, gets to Edinburgh, signs a treaty with the Scots in 1482. His court, meanwhile, Edward's court is dominated by his wife's family, the Woodvilles. So Edward dies in 1483 after sickness. He entreats everybody to get along after his death. His express wish is that Richard, Duke of York, his loyal, beloved brother, should become the Lord Protector for his young son, Edward, Prince of Wales. But as soon as Edward dies, all these plans begin to basically fall apart. The Woodvilles, who don't trust Richard at all, decide that they can do away with the Lord Protector entirely if they crown Edward, the young Edward, as soon as possible. So they send to Wales, where the prince is stationed. They say, "Get to London." But Richard hears about this. He intercepts this party, takes the young boy Edward into his own custody, kills the Woodville party that was basically bringing him to London, and sets up the rule of his protectorship, puts Edward and his younger brother Richard into the tower supposedly for safekeeping, sets up a royal council initially. Whether or not it's true, finds treason inside the council, has some more of Edward's loyal followers executed. The Queen panics, and goes back to Westminster, where she'd been while Edward was in exile in Burgundy, goes back, finds sanctuary in Westminster. Richard, for any number of possible reasons, decides that he is going to become king. My own interpretation of this is, once again, it's the security dilemma. He thinks that if he ever, that he is not secure enough simply being the protector, that it would be too easy for him to be basically murdered unless he has all the lawful power he can get into his hands. So he basically, with the help of his own kind of kingmaker, the Duke of Buckingham, he takes power. No one ever hears, Edward, the young Edward is never crowned. So while he has the name Edward V for history's sake, I mean, it didn't really happen. The boys are never heard from again, and one of the great controversies, of course, is about the quote, what they're called the princes in the tower, what actually happened to them. Were they spirited away? Were they killed? If they were killed, who killed them? No one will ever know. Certainly it was Richard's responsibility, regardless of their legal status, even though they had been declared illegitimate, and that was the reason legally why he was able to take the throne. He had the responsibility of protecting them nonetheless. Richard basically has it said publicly that his brother Edward had actually had a marriage contract with someone before Elizabeth Woodville, and as a result, the marriage with Elizabeth Woodville that produced all these children, made these children, was a bigamous marriage, and so these children were all illegitimate. So Richard uses this grounds basically to become king. But as I said, it's still his responsibility to keep the boys safe, and they are never seen again. Now, usually when kings are done away with, prisoners are done away with, usually in the late Middle Ages, and we've seen this any number of times in our talks today, usually what happens is you display the bodies. People may know you did it, but they won't question whether or not this person is dead, so they're not the center anymore of intrigue as a result. Richard doesn't do that. He doesn't produce the bodies. Now, if any of you have seen The White Queen or read the novels, one of the things that I think is most skillful about it is nobody to this day, as I say, knows what happened. And there's all this intrigue going on at court for the two turbulent years of Richard's rule. Everybody's discussing where the two boys are, but nobody really knows. Are they in the tower? Are they alive? Are they dead? And there's this it's just a kind of this time of great darkness. I mean, there are chronicles both in England and abroad that refers to them as being dead, but nobody really knows. Then some years ago, I think in the early 1900s, they found bones where they think the boys might have been, but they've never been able to definitively link those bones to the princes. So again, no one knows or will ever know. At any rate, Richard takes power. His most important supporters are Thomas Stanley. The Stanleys own enormous lands in the northwest of England. Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, who has greatest powers on the Scottish border. John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and Thomas Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. By the end of the reign, only one of those people is going to prove truly loyal, John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. As it turns out, in the years in the north, Richard had basically antagonized both the Stanley family and Henry Percy, not because of anything that he'd done that was so terrible, but because he took power on himself at Edward's request that basically crowded out these two and their hereditary power in these regions. So when push came to shove, they were not going to prove themselves loyal to Richard at the end of the day. His reign was very short. It's marked by tax rebates, a particular concern for the poor, favoritism for the north of England, which is the land that he knows the best and the land that has been most loyal to him. And there's some continuity, there's some change. He retains some of Edward's civil servants, but he also, because of some of the rebellions that go on, he transplants some of his northern supporters to the south, basically. And he has this kind of checkered relationship with the Woodvilles, the Woodville family. Eventually, the children come out of sanctuary along with their mother. And Richard has one son and his wife. His son dies fairly early on in 1483 or 1484, before the end of his reign. His wife dies shortly thereafter, so he has no heir of his body, basically. And when his brother's daughters, his nieces, are at court, there become rumors that he is going to marry the oldest niece. And this is apparently believed so strongly that he feels compelled to deny that he has any such intention. So, threats and rebellion. We're coming towards the end. The Tudor claim, Lancaster's best hope. Again, if you look at your genealogy, you'll see the third son of John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. He has a mistress, Catherine Swynford, and he has these children called the Beauforts. One of the Beauforts marries Edmund Tudor, Henry Tudor's father, and thus Henry Tudor has a slight bit of Lancastrian blood, but there is so little left of Lancaster at this point that he is indeed the last hope of any supporters of Lancaster. So the supporters of Lancaster start one more, a bit of intrigue basically, and there's a small-scale rebellion which inexplicably the Duke of Buckingham joins. Buckingham is kind of Richard's right-hand man. He's been rewarded by every possible post, including Constable of England. One wonders what a Tudor administration could have offered him, but he joins it. It may well be that he felt his own security was under threat, and that maybe he had to join this rebellion, otherwise someone else might kill him. Maybe he thought that he could become king in the middle of turmoil between the two principal antagonists. Again, we'll never know. But Buckingham is unsuccessful, and he's taken. The entire rebellion fritters away. He's taken and he's executed. Henry Tudor has been exiled. He's been living in Brittany all this time. He almost lands in 1484, discovers that Buckingham is unsuccessful, sails back. Brittany is just about to hand him over to Richard. Henry learns about it, flees to France, which is bad news for Richard because the French don't trust Richard, and the French are much more willing to give resources to Henry Tudor. So, as I mentioned before, the Prince of Wales, Richard's son, dies, Queen Anne dies. So, 1485, the last year of the Plantagenets, the fateful year. The campaign. Henry Tudor is bound and determined to land in 1485, which he does in Wales. So you can see the antagonist, Richard III, the White Boar. Some think that this is a kind of a corruption of the Latin word eboricum, which was the Roman term for the city of York, and boar and York kind of sound alike. So that he may have taken that as his sign for that reason. And those are those are Henry Tudor's arms after he becomes king. So finally, 1485, Bosworth Field. So those people that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the great supporters, the two Stanleys, it's like a diamond at Bosworth Field. Henry's to the west with his back to Wales. Richard is to the east, his back to London. One Stanley brother is in the north of the battlefield, one Stanley brother is at the south of the battlefield, and it's clear that the Stanleys are going to do what they always do. Wait and see who wins and then join the winning side at just the right moment, which is how they've aggrandized themselves for decades, quite successfully. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, has been charged with Richard to bring the forces, the most loyal forces Richard can count on, the men of the north, to join him. But he's still struggling to bring those people up, and there's some question as to whether or not he really cares enough about this battle to bring them forward as quickly as he can. The Duke of Buckingham at this point, as we know, is dead, killed in rebellion. John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, is the only one who proves loyal. He is in command of the van of Richard's troops. So, the van goes into battle. They are pretty much on their own because Percy has still not brought up the rear guard sufficiently, so Richard is starting to run out of troops. He decides at this fateful moment to perform basically his last act as king. He's got his circlet on his head. He's got his household knights, probably the best group of soldiers in England at this point. He decides he's going to personally confront Tudor on the battlefield. So he rides across the battlefield, and he's within a few, he strikes down every Lancastrian he can get his hand, some of them well over 6 feet. And he's a very small man, but he's a proven warrior. He gets within a few feet of Henry Tudor, and suddenly the Stanleys have decided to move, and they've decided to intervene against Richard. So he has taken down, and this enormous, thousands of soldiers basically descend on him, even though he's within a few feet of Henry Tudor. And he's yelling, "Treason, treason," and those are the last words he utters. He dies. Stanleys grab the crown, put it on Henry Tudor's head. Henry dates his reign from the day before, so that everyone in arms against him will be accused of treason. Very nice, very subtle, typical Henry Tudor. And you can see the new findings. If some of you have kept up on the news the last couple of years, they found Richard's remains. He's the only king who had not been ever interred properly. They found his remains in a parking lot, quite by accident. And he now lies with the proper burial in Leicester Cathedral, and you can see the stone there. So just a quick wrap on this. Continuity and change. Henry VII certainly employs a lot of Yorkist civil servants. This is not this great change from medieval to modern that people have often thought. Henry VII is a very subtle operator. He uses financial coercion to break the power of the great aristocrats in a way, not once and for all, but to diminish it in a way that was something quite new. Again, the Wars of the Roses can be seen as the problem, the relationship between the king and the king's aristocracy. A monopoly of power, but a monopoly requiring the most powerful potential enemies. Finally, colorful personalities, a slow march of change. But the 16th century will be dominated by a totally new factor, which is the issue of religion, the English Reformation. And that's certainly an interesting topic, but one of another time. And with that, I thank you for your kind attention.